They told you Jesus was born of a virgin under a miraculous star. They told you kings traveled across deserts, guided by heavenly lights to kneel at the feet of a newborn. They told you angels filled the sky singing to shepherds. But what if I told you that the very first lie proving Jesus was a myth begins right there in the nativity scene you grew up picturing every Christmas? Because the truth is that these stories did not appear until decades later, written by anonymous authors who were not eyewitnesses and who never even agreed with each other. And that is the shock most people never confront, because the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are the only ones that even mention a virgin birth, and they contradict each other in geography, lineage, and timing, while Mark, the earliest Gospel, and Paul, the earliest Christian writer, never even mention such a miraculous birth. So ask yourself, if this event was so central, how could the earliest sources not know about it? And why did later writers feel the need to invent it? The answer lies in the fact that virgin births were
Before you go, I need to speak to you from the heart. This channel has been demonetized. Not because I stopped caring, but because telling uncomfortable truths has a cost. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for support. I've started a second channel so I can continue this work and survive doing it. If you believe in what I share, please go there, subscribe, and watch the videos. Every view, every minute you watch, truly helps more than you know. Thank you for standing with me. Thank you for listening. And thank you for keeping truth alive. The link is below.
common mythical motif in the ancient world used to elevate figures into the realm of the divine, from the Egyptian god Horus to the Greek demigod Perseus to Alexander the Great, who was also said to be born of a divine union. And by inserting Jesus into this same mythological pattern, the early church was not recording history, they were borrowing from mythology, wrapping their leader in the same supernatural cloak that surrounded pagan heroes. But here is the catch: if the very beginning of the story is borrowed myth, then the entire foundation starts to crumble, because a real person with a real family, a real birthplace, and a real lineage does not need fabricated divine origin stories. Only a myth needs that kind of embellishment, and this is why scholars who examine the nativity accounts side by side call them theological inventions rather than historical memories, because they cannot be reconciled with one another. In Matthew, Jesus is born under the reign of Herod, who dies in 4 before the Common Era, but in Luke, Jesus is born during the census of Quirinius, which took place in 6 of the Common Era. That is a 10-year gap that cannot be harmonized. So either Matthew lied or Luke lied or both lied, but in either case the supposed historical foundation collapses, and if you still hold on thinking maybe they just remembered differently, then ask yourself, why does John, the last gospel, entirely skip the virgin birth and instead speak in metaphysical poetry about the Word becoming flesh? Because John had no interest in grounding the story in history, he wanted theology, not biography, which is another clue that the Jesus narrative was crafted to inspire faith, not to report fact. And this is only the first lie, the lie of the miraculous birth, the lie that set the stage for everything else. And once you realize that this opening scene was lifted from the playbook of pagan myths, you begin to wonder how many more of these lies are hiding in plain sight, because if the virgin birth is myth, then the claim of prophecy fulfillment is also myth, because Matthew rips verses out of the Hebrew scriptures, like Isaiah 7:14, which does not even say virgin but young woman, and applies it to Jesus retroactively, twisting Jewish texts to invent the illusion of prophecy fulfilled. And that means the so-called prophecies were not predictions of Jesus, but deliberate rereadings after the fact, designed to make it seem like the Hebrew scriptures pointed to him all along. And that deception is one of the boldest, because it hijacks an entire religion's sacred writings to justify a myth. And once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it, because the very people who claim divine truth were the ones distorting texts to manufacture belief. And here is the piercing question you must ask yourself: if the beginning of the Jesus story is wrapped in myth, contradiction, and fabrication, what does that say about the rest of it? And if you are feeling a knot in your stomach right now, it is because deep down you know the implications are huge, that the figure billions revere may not be a historical man, but a myth built on lies. And this is only the first of 6 lies we will expose. Lies that prove beyond doubt that Jesus was a myth. Lies that no institution, no church, no authority can deny once you lay the evidence bare, and this is why you cannot. Look away, because if you do, you risk living your life chained to a story that was never true in the first place. And if that thought unsettles you, then stay with me, because what comes next will shake you even harder, because the birth is only the opening act of the myth, and the second lie will take us deeper into the core of the story, into the miracles that never happened. But before we step there, remember this: every myth begins with a miraculous origin, and every myth requires the audience to suspend disbelief. So once you break that spell at the very beginning, the entire illusion starts to collapse. And right now, we are breaking that spell together, peeling back the first layer of deception. And once you see it, there is no going back, because truth once seen cannot be unseen, and that truth is this: the virgin birth is not history, it is mythology, and mythology does not create gods, it creates stories, and that means Jesus is not a divine figure stepping into human history. He is a mythic invention, and this is just the first lie exposed. They told you Jesus walked on water, that he calmed raging seas with a word, that he fed thousands with a few loaves and fishes, that he raised the dead back to life, that he healed the blind and the lame with a touch, and that every miracle confirmed his divine identity. But here is the second lie that proves Jesus was a myth, because these so-called miracles were never eyewitness accounts, but rather literary inventions, crafted decades after the fact by anonymous writers who never met Jesus, and who borrowed these miracle stories from older myths and religious traditions. Because if you look closely, you will see that these miracles are not unique to Christianity at all. They are recycled tropes that existed long before. Tropes about gods and demigods performing wonders to prove their divinity, from Dionysus turning water into wine to Asclepius healing the sick and even raising the dead, from Moses parting the Red Sea to Elijah multiplying food and raising a widow's son. All of these miracles were part of the cultural library of the ancient world, and the gospel writers dipped into that library to give their mythical hero the same supernatural powers. But here is the problem: if Jesus truly performed such miracles, why did Paul, the earliest Christian writer, never mention them? Because Paul wrote in the 50s of the 1st century, decades before the Gospels, and in all his letters, he never refers to Jesus feeding multitudes, walking on water, or raising Lazarus. And the silence is deafening, because Paul was desperate to win converts, so if those miracles had actually happened, he would have used them, yet he never did, which means they did not exist yet. They were added later, which proves they are inventions. And when we step into the Gospels themselves, we see contradictions everywhere, because Mark's version of the feeding miracle describes 5,000 fed, while Matthew and Luke copy but alter details, and John creates an entirely different framework around it. And the most striking contradiction is the raising of Lazarus in John, a miracle so dramatic that if it had happened, it would be impossible for the other Gospels to ignore. Yet Matthew, Mark, and Luke never mention it, not even a whisper, and that is because John invented it, placing Jesus into the mold of a divine life-giver in order to inspire belief. And that should make you pause, because if the biggest miracles were fabricated, what does that say about all the others? And if the miracles were not historical but literary, then the picture of Jesus as a supernatural being collapses, because myths always use miracles as proof of divinity, not history. And here is the chilling reflection: if you strip away the miracles, what are you left with? A man whose story looks indistinguishable from other myths, a figure shaped not by eyewitnesses, but by literary creativity. And this is exactly what scholars have been pointing out for centuries, that the miracle stories are midrash, reimaginings of older stories from the Hebrew Bible and Greco-Roman mythology, reshaped to make Jesus look like a new Moses, a new Elijah, a new Dionysus. And if that is true, then the Jesus of miracles is no different than Hercules slaying beasts or Krishna lifting mountains, both inspiring, both captivating, both myth. And here is the piercing question: if you once believed in these miracles as literal truth, how does it feel to realize that they were crafted illusions, carefully designed to elevate a figure into the realm of myth? And what does it mean for your faith if those miracles never happened? Because the church has always told you that the miracles prove the resurrection, but if the miracles collapse into myth, then the resurrection has no foundation either. And this is where the spiral begins, because once you recognize that these miracle accounts were invented to make Jesus look divine, you understand that the authors were not preserving memory, They were creating myth. And every myth must entertain, must inspire, must capture the imagination, which is exactly what these miracle stories do. They thrill the reader, they awe the believer, they silence the skeptic. But history does not thrill. History records, and the Gospels do not record. They perform, which is why this second lie is so devastating, because it reveals that the Jesus people worship was built on borrowed wonder tales, not on fact. And here is the haunting realization: if the miracle stories were not real, then countless people across history lived, fought, killed, and died over illusions, over stories no different than those of pagan gods. And if that does not shake you, then nothing will, because when the miracle stories fall apart, the claim of divinity falls apart, and the entire myth of Jesus is laid bare, which is why they cannot deny it, because the evidence is too overwhelming, the contradictions too obvious, the silence of Paul too deafening, and the parallels with older myths too precise. And that means this is the second lie exposed, the lie of miracles, the lie that tried to make myth look like fact. But when you look beneath the surface, fact vanishes and myth remains. And now that you have seen this second lie, you know the story is unraveling piece by piece. And what comes next will be even harder to face, because if the birth was myth and the miracles were myth, then what about the crucifixion, the very centerpiece of the faith? The event people think is the one sure historical anchor. But what if I told you that even that was a lie, and that the crucifixion narrative itself was manipulated, reshaped, and filled with contradictions, and that this third lie will shatter whatever certainty you still have left? So take a deep breath, because the next step down this path is the one that will change everything, and once you hear it, there will be no turning back. They told you that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that the sky darkened, that the earth shook, that the temple veil tore in two, that graves opened and dead people walked into Jerusalem, that soldiers stood in awe and declared surely this was the Son of God, and that this moment of cosmic drama was the ultimate proof of his identity. But here is the third lie that proves Jesus was a myth, because when we peel back the layers of the crucifixion story, we find not history, but contradiction, not eyewitness testimony, but theological invention. Because first we must confront the silence of history itself. The Roman world was meticulous about executions, especially public ones meant to deter rebellion. Yet outside the Gospels, there is no contemporary record of Jesus being crucified under Pilate, not in Roman annals, not in Jewish records, not in the writings of Philo, who lived in Alexandria at the same time and wrote extensively about Pilate, not in the works of Josephus, whose references to Jesus are later Christian interpolations, which means that the so-called most important execution in human history went unnoticed by everyone except the anonymous gospel authors, writing decades later. And if that does not disturb you, it should, because what kind of execution shakes the earth, darkens the sky, and raises the dead but leaves no trace in any record, not even among Jerusalem's population, which should have been terrified by such cosmic events? The answer is simple: it never happened. These were literary devices, myths layered on to elevate the story, but the contradictions go deeper, because the Gospels cannot agree on what happened during the crucifixion. In Mark, Jesus cries out in despair that God has abandoned him, while in Luke he is calm and forgiving, while in John he is in control and declares it is finished. These are not minor details. These are entirely different portrayals of the same supposed event, revealing that the authors were shaping theology, not reporting history. And when we look at the trial narratives, we see the same pattern. Mark presents a chaotic Jewish trial at night. John presents a calm, philosophical conversation with Pilate. Matthew adds details to fulfill Old Testament prophecies. And Luke rearranges events altogether. 4 different stories, 4 different theologies, one supposed event. And that tells you the crucifixion story was not history, but mythologized drama, crafted for believers, not eyewitnesses. But here is where the lie becomes more obvious, because Roman crucifixions were public and shameful. Victims were left to rot on crosses outside city walls, denied burial as a warning. Yet the Gospels tell us that Jesus was honorably buried in a tomb by a sympathetic council member named Joseph of Arimathea, a figure unknown to history and suspiciously symbolic in name, because Arimathea does not exist as a real town in any ancient record, which raises the chilling possibility that Joseph of Arimathea was a literary creation invented to give Jesus a dignified burial, so that the resurrection story could follow. Because without a tomb, there is no empty tomb, and without an empty tomb, there is no resurrection. And here is the deeper deception. The crucifixion narrative is loaded with Old Testament references, almost as if the writers were not describing history, but crafting a script. Psalm 22 with its words about pierced hands and mocked sufferer, Isaiah 53 with its suffering servant, Zechariah with its pierced figure, all reinterpreted and retrofitted onto Jesus, creating the illusion of prophecy fulfilled. And this is the shocking truth. The crucifixion account was written backward from prophecy, not forward from history. The authors shaped events to match scriptures, not scriptures to match events, and that means the crucifixion as presented is a literary myth designed to give theological weight to a figure who otherwise would have disappeared into obscurity. But ask yourself this: if the crucifixion narrative is riddled with contradictions, propped up by scripture twisting and utterly absent from contemporary records, what does that say about its historicity? The answer is devastating. It means the crucifixion as told is a lie, a myth masquerading as memory. And once you realize that, the entire faith begins to unravel, because the crucifixion is the cornerstone, and if the cornerstone is cracked, the building collapses. And here is the haunting reflection. Billions of people have looked to a cross as their source of hope. Countless wars and crusades were fought under its banner. Entire civilizations were shaped by it. Yet the cross itself may have never been more than a story written to inspire loyalty, a myth crafted to control, and if that does not shake you to your core, then nothing will. Because what you thought was the most certain historical fact about Jesus may be the very thing that proves he was never more than a myth. And if the crucifixion collapses, then the resurrection collapses with it, and that is the next lie we must expose. The fourth lie, the lie of the resurrection, the lie that claims life triumphed over death, but which upon closer inspection reveals itself as the greatest fabrication of all. So brace yourself, because what comes next will cut even deeper, stripping away the last illusion and forcing you to confront the possibility that Jesus, from birth to miracles to death, was never a historical figure at all, but a myth built on lies. And if that realization unsettles you, it is because deep down you already know that myths do not change history. People do. And if Jesus never existed as they claimed, then what you were told about him was never truth. It was only story. And that is the third lie exposed. They told you that Jesus rose from the dead, that the stone was rolled away, that angels stood at the empty tomb, that women ran trembling to tell the disciples, that the risen Jesus appeared in locked rooms, on the road, by the sea, and that hundreds saw him alive again. But here is the fourth lie that proves Jesus was a myth, because when we examine the resurrection narratives, they unravel into contradictions, inventions, and myths borrowed from the religious imagination of the ancient world. Because first we must confront the fact that Paul, the earliest Christian writer, never mentions an empty tomb, never mentions women at the grave, never describes angels or stone rolling. His entire description in 1 Corinthians 15 is simply a creed that Christ died, was buried, rose, and appeared, a creed that names appearances, but not one detail of narrative. And that is because when Paul wrote in the 50s of the first century, the story of the empty tomb did not exist yet. It was invented, later by Mark around 70, decades after the events supposedly took place. And if the empty tomb was the central piece of evidence, how could the earliest writer know nothing of it? The answer is obvious. It had not been created yet. And when Mark creates it, he ends his gospel abruptly with the women fleeing in fear and telling no one, which makes no sense because if they told no one, the story could not spread, which reveals that Mark's ending is a dramatic cliffhanger, not history. And later, Gospels fix this by adding appearances, adding conversations, adding physical contact, because each new author had to outdo the last to make the story more convincing. And here is the devastating realization: the resurrection narratives grow in detail and spectacle, the further away they are from the supposed event. Exactly what happens with legends and myths, not with history, but the contradictions expose it even more. In Matthew, the women encounter Jesus at the tomb. In Luke, they do not. In John, Mary Magdalene mistakes him for a gardener. In Paul, he appears first to Peter, not to Mary, which means the earliest account has no women at all. And this silence is telling, because women were not considered credible witnesses in that culture, so later authors inserted them to give the story dramatic flair. But Paul omits them because the tradition did not exist yet. And then there are the irreconcilable contradictions about where the appearances happened. In Matthew, it is in Galilee. In Luke, it is in Jerusalem. In John, it is both. In Acts, it stretches out for 40 days. These cannot all be true, which means none of them are. They are theological fictions, shaped to give hope to communities struggling with doubt. But here is the more chilling piece. Resurrection stories were not unique. In fact, they were common. Osiris in Egypt, Attis in Phrygia, Dionysus in Greece, Mithras in Rome, all gods who died and rose again. Their worshippers celebrated their return to life as cosmic. Victories over death, and the Jesus story fits neatly into this mythic pattern, which means it was not history but imitation, borrowing the ancient language of death and rebirth to create a new myth for a new movement. And when you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it, because myths of resurrection were the spiritual currency of the ancient world, and Jesus was written into that mythic economy. But here is the harshest reflection. Billions of people today build their hope for eternal life on this resurrection story. Entire civilizations built their morality on it. Countless lives were shaped by the belief that death was defeated, but if the resurrection never happened, then all of it rests on a lie, and the church knows it, which is why they guard this story with such ferocity, because without the resurrection the entire faith collapses. Paul himself admitted as much when he said, "If Christ has not been raised, then our faith is in vain." And that is the cruel irony, because the resurrection is the least historical part of the story, yet it is the one that faith clings to, which makes this lie the most devastating. But it does not stand alone, because tied to it is the fifth lie, the lie that Jesus was unique, when in reality his story was a copy of older myths, rebranded for a new audience. And when we confront that, the myth of Jesus becomes undeniable. So as we step into the next layer, you must prepare yourself, because if the resurrection collapses into myth, then what remains is only imitation, and imitation means fabrication, and fabrication means Jesus was never real. He was always a myth shaped from older stories, and that is the next truth we will expose. They told you Jesus was utterly unique, that no other figure in history had ever been like him, that no other religion had ever dared to claim a God who came down as a man, suffered, died, and rose again, that Christianity was unlike anything before it. But here is the fifth and the sixth lie that together tear down the last illusion and prove Jesus was a myth. Because when we look into the ancient world, we find that every element of the Jesus story was already told long before, borrowed, and repackaged, not original, not unique, and certainly not historical, because in Egypt Osiris was killed, dismembered, and resurrected as lord of the underworld. In Greece, Dionysus turned water into wine and offered salvation through his blood. In Rome, Mithras was worshipped as a savior born from a rock whose followers celebrated a sacred meal that looks strikingly like communion. In Phrygia, Attis died and rose again, bringing fertility and hope, and these stories existed centuries before. Christianity, meaning the Jesus story, was a patchwork quilt of older myths, sewn together to give a new religion cultural resonance, and this is the fifth lie, the lie of uniqueness, because Christianity was not new revelation, but recycled mythology, and the church has hidden this by demonizing pagan parallels, by convincing believers that any similarity was coincidence or demonic imitation. But the truth is clear. The Jesus story is myth upon myth, and once you see it, you cannot deny it. But then comes the sixth and final lie, perhaps the most dangerous of all, the lie of the documents, because the church has always told you that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, eyewitnesses or companions of eyewitnesses. But history shatters this claim because these names were attached decades later. The texts themselves are anonymous, written in Greek by educated men far removed from Palestine, filled with errors about geography, culture, and Jewish law, proving the authors were not eyewitnesses. And then the letters of Paul, which are our earliest documents, reveal no details about Jesus' life, no Bethlehem, no Nazareth, no Mary, no Joseph, no miracles, no parables, not even a ministry. Paul's Jesus is a cosmic figure revealed through visions and scripture, not a man of flesh and blood, which means the written foundation of Christianity is not biography, but theology, not memory, but myth-making. And that means the sixth lie is that the documents preserve history when in reality they create it, and when the church suppressed alternative gospels, burned rival writings, and silenced dissenting voices, They were not protecting truth. They were curating a myth, shaping one version of a story and erasing all others. And this is why the Jesus story feels seamless today, because it was edited, polished, and enforced by power, not preserved by memory. And that is the final nail in the coffin of historicity, because when birth is myth, miracles are myth. Crucifixion is myth, resurrection is myth, uniqueness is myth, and the documents themselves are myth-making. Then the conclusion is inescapable. Jesus was never a historical figure. He was always a myth, a composite created from the imagination of men, shaped by older traditions, enforced by institutions and worshipped by billions, who never realized the lies they were told. And here is the haunting reflection. If this truth already shakes you, imagine what still lies hidden in archives. Imagine what other suppressed texts never survived. Imagine how different the world would be if the myth had been exposed earlier. And ask yourself how many wars, how many persecutions, how many lives were destroyed because of a story that never happened. And if you feel the weight of that realization, then you understand why this matters. Because truth sets you free, and the truth is that Jesus was a myth, and they cannot deny it, no matter how hard they try. And if you have followed me through these 6 lies, then you already know that you have crossed a point of no return. Because once you see the scaffolding of myth propping up the figure of Jesus, you cannot go back to blind belief. You can only go forward into truth. And if this journey has stirred you, if it has opened your eyes to how deep the deception runs, then do not stop here, because there is more to uncover, more lies to expose, more myths to unravel. So subscribe now, so you do not miss what comes next, because the story is bigger than you think, older than you were told, and darker than you ever imagined. And together we will keep tearing down the illusions until only truth remains. Because that is the mission, to awaken, to expose, to free minds from chains forged in myth. And with these 6 lies exposed, the case is undeniable. Jesus was a myth and they cannot deny it.